do not talk about wooden planes very much, which is weird because I love wooden planes. Not only do they work really well, they offer a lot of value. They can be very cheap to buy. Of course, the problem is, most of the wooden planes in the world were made a long time ago, like 100 years ago. And a lot of those planes, they're just too old and beat up to work. So even if you get a good deal on one, you might get it home and find that it's just too damaged, that you can't get it going again. So a lot of the time, there's risk in buying these tools, and maybe that's kept me from making a lot of videos about them. But last week, my buddy Sam called me up, and he said, "Rex, I have great news. I just came back from the thrift store, and I got 2 really old wooden planes for 20 bucks. Isn't that great?" And I thought, 2 wooden planes for 20 bucks. Well, that's either some very cheap tools or some very expensive firewood. This video is about restoring vintage wooden planes. But I would say about 90% of wooden plane restoration is intelligent purchasing. So let's look at some examples. Here's a good one. This plane was made by the Ohio Tool Company. Good, middle-of-the-road American manufacturer. Nothing flashy, but totally dependable. If I found this plane at a yard sale or a flea market, I would start with a quick visual inspection of the outside. And everything looks good. No significant warpage, no big cracks, no water damage. Everything on the exterior of the plane looks fine. So the next most important thing is to go into the mouth. I'll start by looking at the wedge, and it looks fine too. The wedge and the body are the same color. That's important. That means it's probably the original wedge. I'm also going to want to pull the wedge up a little bit. And you can see right here that this wood is lighter than the other wood, because when it's down in the throat, sunlight can't get at it and darken it. You want to see those light marks there, because that means this wedge has been with this plane for a long time. If the wedge is up like this, and you can see those light marks, and you can't easily push it back down with finger pressure, that suggests this could be a replacement wedge, and you don't want to buy a plane that doesn't have the original wedge. When you pull the wedge out, the most important thing to look at is these thin little bits here. These are called the fingers, and they're important because they sit in the plane and they hold that iron down and keep it from chattering. You can have some small splits and cracks. Those are easy to fix, but the fingers need to be there and they need to be the same length. You also want to look at this part here. It should be a nice, smooth surface with a relatively crisp edge. The top of the wedge might be pretty banged up from getting hammered on. That's not a big deal. You can cut a little bit off. The back of the wedge should be flat and pretty free of damage. Once I've seen all of that, I'll set it aside and I'll check out the iron. Now, you want the iron to move back and forth a little bit in the plane. That's really important for lateral adjustment. If there's a lot of space to either side and the iron looks much smaller than the mouth, then this could be a non-original iron, and that's bad. A lot of times tool sellers will just jam any old iron into a wooden plane, and that's probably not going to work. Don't buy a plane like that. Another thing that happens a lot of the time is the plane shrinks with the iron in the throat, and it shrinks so much and makes so much pressure against this piece of steel that the cheeks of the plane, these part here, they actually blow out, and you see big splits and cracks on either side. When you see a plane like that, don't buy it. It's done. Now, I'm going to take the iron out and give it a quick look. Down here in the bed, there's a slot. It goes right like this. This slot is only on planes that are intended for a double iron. It's a slot for this screw to fit in. So when you see this, you want to find an iron with a chip breaker and a screw. You have to have all 3 of those parts or you shouldn't buy the plane. I also want to do a visual inspection down inside. The bed should be nice and flat with no obvious damage. And these parts here, these are called abutments. You can see them a little better if I lift the plane up like this. These hold the wedge in place. And the abutments are one of the most important parts of the plane. They can have little chips or cracks like this one does, but they can't have any severe damage because they're essential to the plane working correctly. Going back to the iron, I want to look at how much blade is left below the slot. Right here, I want at least 3/4 of an inch of usable steel. Now, I have like 2 inches here, so that's great. The other thing I want to look at is the chip breaker. It's in generally good condition, and it's there, which is really important. And I also want to look at the general condition. How much rust is there? This iron is pretty rusty, but it doesn't have any significant pitting. I should be able to save this. Now, the one thing you will see on a plane like this usually is checking. You can see it here on the toe of the plane. These aren't cracks, these are called checks, and they're just places where the grain separated as the wood dried out over time. These checks are usually stable, they're usually not a big deal. The one problem with this plane is right around the mouth here, there's also a lot of checking, especially in the back. Now, what I might do is actually cut out this whole section, inlay a small piece of wood, and recut the mouth. That would get rid of these flaws. And since this plane in general is in really good shape, that repair would probably be very worth doing. But before I did anything like that to a plane like this, I would get it up and running and see if it worked. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now, that last plane was in unusually good shape. This one is more like the planes I usually find. Just looking at it, it's very difficult to tell if this is going to be a usable tool or just a piece of junk. The exterior of the plane is especially bad. There's all sorts of paint streaking on it, lots of chips and scratches. But as you look closer, you can see there's no real damage. There are no cracks, and all the surfaces are flat and smooth. This plane also has an especially good handle. I think it actually came off of another plane. I think the user made this plane. There's no manufacturer's mark anywhere. And he took this off of an old plane and stuck it in the new one he was making, and then he pinned it through with a dowel right here. That's a great feature. That means this handle is never coming out. Missing handles are a big problem. So now I know I kind of like the exterior of the plane. I gotta go into the throat and check out the guts. When I look at my wedge, it's the same thing. There's lighter wood in here, and I can push the wedge in, and it's obviously a good fit. It wobbles a little bit more back and forth, but it obviously came from this plane. That's good. I can also see a pattern of dust on the iron that matches the shape of the wedge. So all these parts have been together for a long time. When I pull the wedge out, it's got fingers. They're in a very different design, but they're there and they're whole, and it's got a nice smooth ramp right here for the shavings to slide up. This wedge is quite beat up from getting hammered on, but that's no problem. I can trim that wood away. When I go and look inside here, the throat of the plane looks honestly just fine. The abutments are in excellent condition, no cracks or splits, and they hold that wedge securely. The biggest problem that I have with this plane is the iron. First of all, it's really short. You can see I've only got maybe 5/8 of an inch after the slot. Now, that's still probably enough steel to last a hobby woodworker for years. So that's not a deal breaker. And it's got the chip breaker and the chip breaker screw, but it's also got a lot of rust, and it's flaky, deeper rust. So it's very difficult to say whether I can save this iron or not. And if I can't save the iron, the plane probably isn't worth anything. I'm really not sure about this. The rest of the plane is in, honestly, really good shape. The rest of the throat is fine. The slot for the chip breaker screw is nice and cleanly cut. This plane actually doesn't have any checking on either side, which is unusual, so it's in good structural condition. The only problem is there's a bit of a crack down here by the mouth, which does suggest there could be some weakness in the cheek of this plane. Still, all in all, I would probably take a chance on this plane, but I wouldn't want to pay too much for it. I would probably want to pay less than $10 for a plane like this, then get it home and see if I can restore it. Now, we've got a pretty good idea of how to pick a wooden plane. Now what we want to do is go look at Sam's planes and see if we can save those. Sam bought 2 planes. The shorter one is a jack, and the longer one is a tri-plane. That's just a slightly short jointer plane. Both planes are beat up and filthy. The tri-plane is missing a handle, and the jack has a handle that's falling out. If I saw these at a yard sale, I wouldn't give them a second look. But maybe I'm too picky. Let's look closer. Except for the missing handle, the tri-plane actually doesn't look too bad. The wedge is clearly original, and it comes out with no trouble. The blade assembly has plenty of room to move back and forth, and it's original too. When I pull the iron assembly out, you can see that the blade still has plenty of steel, and the rust isn't too bad. Amazingly, I don't think this tool saw all that much use. There's a big check in the top of the body where the wood shrank, but it looks stable, and I think I'm going to leave it alone. I'm a lot more concerned about this small crack in the top of the cheek, and another small crack by the mouth. I would have passed right by this plane, but I really want to save it for my buddy. I'll flow a little CA glue into those cracks. You can't beat super glue for small repairs. It penetrates deeply and gives a reliable hold. For large repairs, I'd go with epoxy or wood glue. The wedges from both planes are in surprisingly good shape. They each have some minor cracks and splits, but they aren't too beat up, and more importantly, those long pointed fingers are in excellent condition. I use a piece of paper to sneak a little wood glue into those tight cracks, and then just squeeze clamps to hold things together. These are quick, easy repairs. With all the structural repairs done, it's time to clean these planes and bring up a good surface. First, I strip off all the loose components and use an old toothbrush to clear out the dirt and spider webs from the throat. There's literally a century's worth of dirt and grime on this plane, and I want to remove all of that while also protecting the surface. My favorite technique is boiled linseed oil applied with fine steel wool. The cleaning is a process. I wipe on a thick layer of oil and let it soak in while I wipe down the rest of the plane. After the oil has a chance to start dissolving the gunk, I come back and scrub aggressively with the steel wool. You can see the black dirt come off as I wipe the plane down with a paper towel. There's a lot more where that came from, and I usually repeat the oil and scrubbing at least 3 times, letting each coat soak in for a minute to dissolve more dirt. These planes usually come from the factory unfinished, so you don't need to worry about damaging an old coat of varnish. As you're removing grime, you're also highlighting the color and grain of the beach. Once the jack plane is done, you can see an amazing difference from just a cleaning. The jack no longer looks like a piece of garbage. There might be a quality tool in there after all. Now I'm going to address the sole. This jack plane has led a hard life. The sole is deeply scratched and way out of flat. The fastest way to fix it is with a plane. At this point, you might be saying, hold on, I need to own a plane in order to restore one of these planes? Well, yeah, probably. We're also going to lap this plane on sandpaper later on, but flattening the sole with a plane is much faster and guarantees us a straighter, flatter sole. Also, wooden planes are kind of tricky. I don't recommend you tackle one of these restorations unless you already own 1 or 2 planes and at least understand how to use them. The handle on the jack plane is in bad shape and doesn't fit the body very well. I suspect this is a replacement, and I could make a new and better one, but that takes hours. I did make a complete handle in my recent jointer plane build video, so you can check that out if you want to see the whole process. For Sam's plane, the tote is mostly there, so I'm going to make it work. I use a scraper to take off the old glue, and then I plane the broken spots flat. With these small pieces, it's often handy to put the plane in the vise and move the part over the plane. You get a lot more control. Now, I've cut small pieces of cherry and I'm attaching them to those flat spots with yellow glue and rubber bands as clamps. Cherry is similar to beech, so the finished handle will feel like a single piece. I also use walnut for some of these repairs. Once the glue dries, it's quick to cut away the excess wood and blend the repairs in with the original handle. This is a good opportunity to customize the grip to your hand. These planes often came from the factory with parts that were a little bit too delicate, which is why they broke. When I make repairs, I make the horns and other details a little thicker and rounder to be more durable. These factory-made American wooden planes have 0 collector value, and you shouldn't be afraid to modify them. The triplane doesn't have a tote at all, and I really don't feel like spending 2 hours making one, so I dig through the parts bin and I get lucky. This tote is in decent shape, but when I compare it to a nicer plane, you can see that the back horn is totally missing. This isn't a cosmetic detail. It holds your hand down and keeps your palm from sliding up as you're working. This tote is also a little bit too long for the mortise in the triplane, but that's okay. I can easily trim it to fit, and I'm going to save a lot of time by just grafting on a little bit of wood and carving a new horn. Now, I know what you're saying. Rex, I don't have a bin full of parts that I can just pull a new handle out of. What am I supposed to do for my plane restorations? Well, don't worry, I've got you covered. I've got a printable template with handle designs for both the tri and the jack plane, and I based these off of the best, most comfortable planes in my collection. You can use these templates to make your own handles from scratch, and I'll talk about them more at the end of the video. In the meantime, we also need to prep the mortises for glue up. All that old glue and dirt needs to go. A sharp chisel is just fine, and you don't need to be too picky. You just need clean wood exposed along both sides of the mortises, and you'll get a good bond. Once the handles are repaired and sanded, I'm going to put them back in with epoxy thickened up with sawdust. This way, any little gaps will get filled in, and the epoxy will give a stronger bond than the original hide glue. The tri-plane handle is an especially difficult fit. It's too loose side to side, so I'm adding a strip of veneer to tighten things up. You could also use a thick plane shaving. I'm adding a lot of epoxy around the edges and wiping off the excess for a smooth joint. This handle also leans a bit to the right, so I'm going to use a piece of blue tape to pull the handle plumb while the glue sets. I've already got the jack plane handle back in, but we need something to do while the adhesive dries. So let's take a look at those irons. Both the blades are in pretty good condition, and they both have their original chip breakers, which is very important. I mostly have to take off the rust, and I like a medium wire wheel for this job. I've never really understood chemical rust removers for these small parts. The chemicals take time, and then you have a black residue you have to scrub off, and then the parts are wet and need to be dried. The wire wheel takes off all the rust, leaves a nice surface, and it's a one-step process. If you don't have a bench grinder, they sell wire wheels you can put in a drill press or a cordless drill. I have a bunch of these, and they work really well. Now, I want to set up this jack plane with an aggressive curve or camber at the edge. Traditionally, that curve has a radius somewhere between 8 and 11 inches. You can just wing it, but I prefer to make a quick template. I've got a 10-inch piece of string with loops on either end, and I'll use that to strike an arc on heavy cardstock. Once I cut it out, it's easy to take a marker and trace that radius onto the iron. Now I know what you're thinking. Wait a second, Rex. If jack planes usually had a curved, cambered iron, why isn't that iron already cambered? Why did it come out of the plane so straight? Well, obviously, any plane can be set up lots of different ways, and they call it a jack plane because it's the jack of all trades. I think this one was probably owned by a carpenter or a handyman. If we look at the sole, we can see that it's got a lot of scratches and big streaks of paint. Obviously, somebody was using this thing to trim doors in people's houses. I think this was probably the craftsman's only plane, so he set it up with a straight iron for just sort of general work. We're going to use it to build furniture, and it's going to have the specialized task of hogging off big chunks of material. For that, we want that curved edge. I prefer to do that work over at the grinder. I'm going to start by getting that radius, and I do that straight in with the blade held parallel to the ground. This way, the minimum metal is in contact with the wheel, and there's much less buildup of heat. I keep my thumbs close to the edge to feel when the metal gets warm, and I make sure to cool that blade in water and never let the edge get hot. Once I've got my curvature, I lay the iron on the tool rest, which I keep set at 25 degrees. With the bevel against the wheel, I pivot the blade through that arc to start grinding the shape. Since I have two irons to do, I just alternate between them, grinding one until it gets warm, and then leaving that one in the water while I work on the other iron. For the tri-plane, I'm grinding straight across, and I even check the iron with a square. Usually, these old irons are in terrible shape, and they need a lot of work. These two are no exception, and I'm standing at the grinder for a good 20 minutes. You'll need to grind your new bevel until it almost meets the back. Don't keep grinding until the edge is sharp. If it gets that thin, you probably will burn the steel. Keep grinding until the edge is about the thickness of a piece of paper. If you don't have a bench grinder, you can do the same work a bit more slowly with a honing jig and some sandpaper. I've covered this in several other videos, and I'll link to those down in the description. You're also going to need to flatten the back of the iron, and that takes more work than it does when you're preparing a new plane. These old wooden planes have thick, laminated irons, and sometimes the steel is quite hard. I don't even try to flatten them on my sharpening stones. I go straight to sandpaper on glass. You can see that I have a good flat spot right in the middle, but the edges are low and the back needs a lot more work. This is a good time to own a coarse diamond plate. This one was very cheap, and I wouldn't call it high quality, but it's flat and it's aggressive. It's just what I need to get this iron into shape more quickly. I'll put a link to it down in the description. After the initial flattening, I follow up with my finer stones to get a more polished surface on the back. Now let's look at the chip breakers. They need to sit flat on the iron, although the chip breaker screw will help pull them flat when it's tightened. I still want a flat chip breaker to start with, and you can see that both of these are twisted, and each has a high corner. You can clamp that high corner over the edge of your bench and give it a few good whacks with a steel hammer. That usually helps, but you can also lap the whole underside flat on 100 grit sandpaper. This will give you a flat bearing surface at the front and rear edge, and pretty much guarantee a twist-free chip breaker. You can then further refine that front edge. Keep the body of the chip breaker below the lapping surface, and you'll get a good, shallow angle with a narrow point of contact where the chip breaker meets the blade. Sharpening these blades is straightforward, although it might take longer if you're used to thinner blades from metal planes. I'm using my simple Woodwork for Humans sharpening station. You can get everything you see here for about 50 bucks, and I've got a whole video about putting it together and using it. You can find the links below. That cambered jack plane iron can be a little tricky to hone, but it's pretty easy to master this smooth scooping motion where I'm following the bevel as I move forward on the stone. Give it a try. You might be surprised how quickly you get it. The tri-plane iron is easier to sharpen. It's basically straight across with just a bit of camber. I get all the curve I need by just putting extra pressure first on one corner and then on the other. You probably can't even see me doing it, but that little bit of curve will help keep this iron from digging in, and I'll get much smoother surfaces with this plane. I'm also going to use the sharpening stones to finish my chip breaker. I use any medium stone to work that knife edge and get rid of the deep scratches from the sandpaper. I also want to work across the front and up over the curve. All this back and forth sharpening on a soft piece of steel will raise a big, ugly burr on the end. But I can use my strop to take off the burr and polish the top so the shavings really slide right up and out. Of course, we want a sharp iron, but a lot of people don't understand the chip breaker or don't spend enough time preparing it, and then they're confused when their plane jams or clogs. Here's what you need to do. You need a perfect fit between the front edge of the chip breaker and the back of the iron. And you test that by putting them together with the screw, tightening it down, and then holding the whole thing up to a bright light. And what I'm doing here is I'm looking in this gap on the side, but I'm looking along this front. As I look along that front edge, I shouldn't see any light coming between these two pieces of steel. If there's even a whisker of light, then shavings are going to get up in there and they're going to jam the mouth of your plane right away. Now, unfortunately, it can take a long time to flatten the iron and mate that chip breaker so you get a really, really good connection. But the good news is, once you've done it once, you probably never have to do it again. Both of my irons are flattened and prepared, and I can move on to the final details of this restoration. I generally wouldn't bother staining tool handles, but these look terrible, and they are for someone else. I'm sure they weren't thinking of wooden planes when they invented it, but Minwax English Chestnut Stain is just about the perfect color for plane repairs. It gives me a good color match and hides the patches I glued to the handles. Later on, I'll put a coat of shellac on each handle. The rest of the plane should be unfinished, but I don't want that stain coming off on my hands while I'm working. For a really precise plane, you can lap the bottom with sandpaper on a flat surface. The planing we did before got this plane pretty straight, but we can do even better. For this process, it's very important to have the blade and wedge installed and have the wedge tapped down tightly. The force of the wedge changes the shape of the body, and this is the shape it will be in while we're actually working. So we need to do the final lapping with everything installed and the edge of the blade pulled up into the body. I usually color the sole with a pencil and then slowly remove material until all the pencil lines are gone. Of course, you can also do this with a plane, but there's a little margin for error that way. With sandpaper, you basically can't screw up. After all this work, it doesn't take long to set these planes up and get them going. This is the jack plane, and since I'm going to use it for heavy stock removal, I set it up right away for a deep cut. These are the first shavings this tool has taken in at least 50 years. But it works great and bites off a huge chunk of this pine board. When the shavings fall apart this way, it usually means the iron is set too deep for the mouth opening, and you need to back it off a little. With a little adjustment, I can get a shaving that's still thick, but also stays together. This tool will let me quickly dimension most pieces of wood. Of course, the tri-plane is a much more refined tool, perfectly suited to flattening surfaces and straightening edges. The straighter iron and relatively tight mouth of this plane means that it can take full-length, full-width shavings and leave behind a surface almost as good as a smoothing plane. Now, let's see how both of these planes can work together when we're actually building something. Believe it or not, this is a piece of cherry. It came out of a local barn, and in addition to the rough surface, it's also got a bad hump all along the top face. I'm going to start with my jack plane. Its open mouth and cambered iron let me take off material quickly, even in this hard wood. Here, I'm traversing the board, going across to limit resistance and focus on the high spot. After a couple of passes this way, I can switch to planing along the board and continue to flatten that top face. I get rid of extra material quickly, but the surface is rough and only moderately flat. This is where the triplane excels. That long sole rides over the low spots and only lets the iron nip away at the highest parts, slowly bringing them down until I have a flat board. Of course, I happen to choose the most figured, gnarliest, toughest board in my shop, the one with the most reversing grain. So the plane does get hung up a bit, especially on the end. Still, a big wooden plane like this has more mass than you'd think, and it can power through the tough spots. This isn't even my final finish, and you can see the flat surface and beautiful figured grain of this cherry. These old planes can still do some very good work. Now, these planes are both working and fully restored, but I wouldn't say they're done. They still need to be sort of tuned up. That's kind of a process. What you really want to do is use these planes as much as you can over a few weeks, and I guarantee you're going to find some things that need to be adjusted. You might have to mess with that wedge a little bit or fit that chip breaker again. You might find the bottom of the plane needs to be lapped again. These are all normal things that happen. When you have a new tool or a tool that's been out of service for decades, you're going to find a bunch of little things that have to be fixed. Of course, once you do fix them, you might have a tool that works really well. Some of these old wooden planes are just as good as even some fancy new planes. You'd be surprised how well they work once they're really tuned. Now, you might have a restoration like this that you want to tackle, and you might have to make some handles. So I've got that printable handle template I talked about earlier in the video. I usually charge for my plans, but I really want people to tackle these restorations and get these old planes working again. So I'm going to make this template free. You can grab it, and a lot of other free plans, honestly, over at rexkruger.com/store, where I've also got a lot of affordable plans for other projects. Like last week, I made this beautiful 6-board early American blanket chest with lovely nailed construction and hand-cut trim. You can grab the complete plans for that project for only $5. And I'm at the end of this video, and it's pretty good. I covered the restoration process pretty well, but God, there's so much more to talk about with wooden planes. I mean, there's so many sizes and styles. Which ones do you need? What makes a complete kit? How do you adjust them? I didn't even talk about adjusting these planes. That's a big topic. So I think what I'm going to do is come back next week and do another complete video on choosing and using these planes, and try to cover all the details that I couldn't get to in this video. So make sure you hit that bell icon so that you never miss a video. And if you're enjoying this content, you can check me out over at patreon.com/RexKruger. My patrons make this content possible, and I give them all sorts of extras and rewards to say thanks. I'll see you next week for part 2 in my wooden plane series. Thanks so much for watching.